Oh, I don't know. One of these days, perhaps by episode 500, I'll start with a cold open, much like I am now. Then give way to an intro theme bumper type thing with some pithy pull quotes from the backlog of the show from a few guests, and then into the intro proper. I don't know. Maybe that'll work. Should I even read my house ad for editorial services? I don't think so. But if you want someone to help crack the code, see if you need someone to see what you can't see, consider reaching out and we can start a dialogue. creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com. I guess that was a house ad.
You know, with writing, it's easy because I can say, okay, John, meditate, walk around, get this son of a bitch out of your mind.
Oh, new sponsor alert, the word epistograph. Now, a manuscript, parchment, or book having writing on both sides of the leaves. My Prefontaine biography, if the publisher doesn't pull the plug, is an example of an epistograph. John Julius Reel, bless his patient heart, is on the show. We recorded this episode in late 2023. It doesn't matter. It was a long time ago, and me being the glorious dickhead that I am, I had accrued, and have accrued, an upsetting amount of unpublished interviews that I must produce to honor these generous guests and you, the listener. At long last, you'll get to enjoy this wonderfully insightful conversation with John. You know, we talked for nearly 2 hours, and I cut some big chunks of it just, you know, because you got it. I'm not going to be one of those podcasters that dumps a 2 or 3 hour podcast on you. I said I was a glorious dickhead a moment ago. I'm not that big of a dickhead. I'll share some of the deleted scenes, if you will, with the Patreon crew. Why not? There's some baseball talk in there. John was a very good athlete in his day. So we talked about our bad, rotten heads in athletics and the perils of self-awareness. I'm on fire in this intro. My gosh, coming out the blocks. Okay, John's memoir, My Half Orange, A Story of Love and Language in Seville, is a brilliant memoir. Really is. Published by Tortoise Books, and it bridges John's native country, being the U.S., and his adopted country of España, Spain. His father was a titan in New York City journalism, a columnist with millions of readers, and John wrestled with developing as a writer in the shadow of that. You know, and by moving to Spain and throwing himself into the language, you know, he found his voice. He also found the love of his life and a family he never thought he would ever start. All of that by emigrating to Spain. Pretty cool. John also has a great presence on Instagram doing micro language lessons, and he has a YouTube channel called Book Rants where he reviews primarily memoirs, you know, somewhat off the cuff. He does a lot of thinking about it, but he's not reading from a script in the way that I'm reading off a script. Though the last couple sentences I just said, including this one, this ongoing sentence is not in my script. This one is off the cuff. He's a very good speaker, I'm reading now, and can articulate things beautifully on the fly. Show notes to this episode and more at brendanamara.com. Hey, there you can sign up for my Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Its primary aim is to give you the juice, man. Maybe put a smile on your face. It's not merely a self-promotional tool, though on some level it is. If every subscriber to this podcast subscribed to the newsletter, I'd be one happy CNF bro. And that's what I am, dude. Also, there's Patreon. New patron alert thanks to Carol Marsh for joining the crew. Welcome. Always nice. Also, only one patron from the $4 to $10 tiers has taken me up on the office hours offer that I now bake into those tiers as a further incentive to help subsidize this show. You know, the post and the link to book is still up there, and I am cataloging, who gets what and when and how much and so forth. Go there. Go look. Patreon.com/ CNF pod. If you factor in what my hourly rate would be versus what you're getting for a couple clams a month, the CNF pod CFO would lose their mind. A little more about John. His memoir took him 10 years to get right. He also has a radio gig in Andalusia's public radio affiliates, stations. His Rants from a Foreign Land is on Substack. He's working on another memoir about his athletic career, which I can't wait to read when it publishes. It's his memoir will really rhyme with mine. It'll be cool. It'll be cool if they ever come out, and if they come out around the same time, because that'd be really cool to, I don't know, sing each other's praises, right? In this conversation, we dig into how he surrenders to his subconscious, writing through the bad stuff to get to the good. I always like talking about that, and how self-awareness can be a great asset, but my gosh, also a curse. So, CNFers, let's get after it. Riff.
That aspect of the game, like every time I did well, I would make an excuse. Say, well, the pitcher wasn't that good, or the team wasn't that good. Like I would always play down my. I didn't
Yeah.
know how to take advantage of highs, and then I give much more weight to my lows. Like I was much more. I was brought much lower by an 0 for 4 day than I was brought high by a 4 for 4 day. Like
Yeah.
I didn't know how to ride the wave. You know, it's one of the skills that I learn over time. It's like, how do you, for example, with the book stuff, how do you, because when I'm confident, I write better. I just do. So, something happened today, something good happened today. I'm going to think about that. I'm going to meditate about that so that I write better tomorrow. And then something bad happens, something that affects my self-esteem. Well, then I have to work against that. But like I have to sort of go know my weaknesses and sort of ride with them. I know I'm the type of person to downplay my achievements. So I've got to say to myself, well, John, you did something. Think about what you did. What you did is important, because if you don't think about that, you won't write well tomorrow. And I know I'm someone who overplays my defeats. So I have to think about my defeats. Say, John, what would you say to a friend who just went through what you've gone through? Would you tell them that they're a piece of shit and they've got no future? No, you wouldn't. You would don't speak to yourself. Speak to yourself like you would speak to other people. Respect yourself and give yourself a certain amount of credit for what you've done. So, I mean, I've learned a lot of lessons from the failures that happened to me when I was a schoolboy. Like, I also went pretty far in sports. I made my Division I football team as a wide receiver, but then I quit
Yeah.
before I could even figure out how far I could have gone. Like, I just didn't want to deal with failing again, like I had failed in baseball, like I'd failed in basketball. I just wanted to make my dad happy. And once he was happy, I lost all desire to continue. I was so wrapped up in I don't know what. I'm still trying to figure it out, really, at 56 years old. Imagine
Yeah.
that, right?
Exactly. I just heard an interview with Mark Maron and Taika Waititi, the filmmaker, and his Taika's father has long passed, and they were just talking about how every movie he still makes is still trying to impress his dad. He's like, my dad's been
Sure.
dead for years, and I'm still trying to impress the guy.
Totally. No, and that plays a lot into the book that we're going to talk about. I mean, that's very much, writing like sports was my way to impress my father. When I decided to leave my life in New York behind, and I said, well, I'm going to set out and try to remake my life in Seville to a degree. I mean, I won't say that was my first vision of the future. I thought I was going to go to Seville, learn the language in 1 or 2 years, return to New York, and then live the Latin side of New York to the fullest. That's what I thought. Okay. But
Mm.
also, there was living in the shadow of my father's success as a writer. as a columnist in at the New York Daily News, where he would, he had 3 million readers on Sunday, and people would approach him in the street, and priests and my teachers, my priests, the priests in my at my parish would all look up to him and admire him. And I remember once, as I write in the book, like sitting on the bus and seeing someone read his column and burst out laughing. And then starting in the business and people tell me you'll never be the writer your dad was. I lived in that kind of
Mm.
shadow. I think he felt for me because I was living in his shadow. And then I went abroad to Spain, met my future wife, my half orange, and after 3 years there, I told myself, okay, if I'm going to really learn the language, I'm going to have to stop reading and writing in English. I'm going to have to only do it in Spanish. And I started doing that. I wrote 5 or 6 pieces in Spanish. I sent them to the editor of the local newspaper, and he decided to publish them. And I got a weekly column in the local paper. The first 10 of those pieces, there ended up being 100. The
Mm.
first 10 of them, I was able to say, "Look, Dad, I did it. I became a writer too. I became a journalist. I became a columnist like you without your connections." It was really kind of miraculous in a way that I ended up sort of with this with a similar destiny, you know, despite sort of leaving behind all his clout, which I hoped wouldn't get me there in New York, but didn't. It was really, really bizarre, really bizarre. That my father had very little ambition. His ambition was to be a family man. His ambition was to go to all my little league games, all my basketball games, and he always was very, very supportive. He was very, very supportive as an editor. I think for many, many years, I burdened him with my stuff, and I think a lot of it was very, very I know a lot of it was very, very bad, but he encouraged me nonetheless. So, no, I was very, very lucky, Brendan, in that I never had to deal with my father exacerbating that sort of shadow that I felt existed. I mean, I think a lot of it was just a figment of my imagination too. I was like just like in sports when we were talking before. I mean, when I stepped up to the plate, all the pressure was really imagined. I would say, let's say 80% of it was imagined. Okay. And I think I'd say 80% of that shadow was imagined too. But just because it was imagined doesn't mean it didn't affect me. It affected me tremendously, you know? And having it lifted off my shoulders when I came to Spain helped me, let's say, find my groove and maybe write with a kind of comfort that I didn't know before. Also, writing in Spanish was fascinating because the book or a version of the book was first published in Spanish. Those 100 articles that I originally wrote in Spanish ultimately were converted into My Half Orange. And so I had the tendency before I started writing in Spanish to maybe disguise my lack of experience, my lack of wisdom, or to show off my talent by with flourishes of prose. And I think that it was a real detriment to my writing. But once I started writing in Spanish, if I didn't say something, there was absolutely no hope of capturing the reader because I just did not master prose in Spanish well enough to even try to show off.
Mm.
So the
Mhm.
idea of sitting down and writing a sentence, I knew the sentence had to say something, and that ultimately transferred over to writing in my native tongue. I saw that I could communicate something if I just shed any pretense to style, or I stopped trying to give an impression. I just said, okay, this is what's in my head. This is the pure information, whether that be factual or emotional, that I'm just going to put out there for the reader.
Yeah.
And it was working in Spanish. And imagine in English, because I have a mastery of a certain nuance that I just do not have in Spanish. I just don't. I can't produce in Spanish what I can produce in English as far as prose. I just can't. I can't pull a sentence together as efficiently in Spanish as I can in English. I mean, it's normal. It's the same when in spoken Spanish and English. I'm always a beat behind in my second language.
How long did it take you to when you were learning Spanish to not constantly like translate what you were hearing in Spanish to English and just fully absorb it and just metabolize in Spanish without having to do the internal translation?
It's a good question. I still do it sometimes when I'm nervous. I think that if I'm having a conversation in my comfort zone with somebody about something that I know, I can almost sound like a native in Spanish. But if I'm outside of my comfort zone, whether that's, for example, I go to the bank, there's a whole vocabulary that comes with going to the bank, and I'm not fluent in that vocabulary. Or if I'm sort of speaking about something at the limits of my sort of emotional capacity, sometimes my Spanish breaks down and I begin to sort of translate or, let's say, speak in Spanish but think in English. And so the Spanish becomes quite clumsy. As we were saying before about how much self consciousness is, so language, speaking language is a skill. It's not
Mm.
knowledge, it's a skill. And so skills are affected by self awareness. When you play an instrument or when you play a sport or when you speak a language, well, those are three very good examples. You sing, for example. What ends up being the production is very much affected by your emotion. If I'm feeling confident, I speak Spanish so much better than if I'm not feeling confident. I work on the radio here. I work in sort of the Andalusian public radio.
Mhm.
I'm on three different shows, and if I'm having, Brendan, a hard time with my wife, if things are not going well with my wife, and it's affecting my emotional state, it's noticeable when I go on the radio. Maybe not to everybody, but I listen to myself and I'm like, how could I possibly have forgotten that word? The other day, I couldn't remember the word for popcorn in Spanish. And I was like, what? I mean, how could I not know the word for popcorn in Spanish? I know that word. I've known that word for 18 years, but it didn't come up because I was having a hard day emotionally. So it's amazing how much emotion affects fluency, and it affects, let's say, the how articulate a person is. It's very it affects it, I'm an emotional person and it affects me. I've learned to hide it to a degree, but I see it happening. I see myself stumbling over words and I know it's not because I don't know it. It's because my mind is elsewhere.
And a moment ago you said something like that was really poignant in that, skills are affected by self-awareness. I love hearing you say that. And if you're an artist or you have to like to not be judgmental on yourself as you're learning the new skill. And I wonder for you, like even in those moments of developing as a writer, how have you maybe cultivated a sense of trying not to be judgmental of yourself as you're learning something new, be it writing, be it sports, be it a new language?
Well, it's funny with writing, we have an advantage because really it's not like performance art. I mean, I guess it could be. You could turn it into that. I mean, there are writers out there who don't really, I think, revise their work. And sometimes that work has a tremendous energy that other work doesn't have. Like, for example, Henry Miller. I'm a big fan of Henry Miller. I don't like Tropic of Capricorn, but Tropic of Cancer, especially the last 50 pages, you just got the sense that he was just in a zone and he wrote it. And has this tremendous energy that almost feels like it hasn't been revised. But I'm not that kind of writer. That's a huge advantage because I know that I have the final say on whether when this thing is before an audience. And when it's before an audience, I'm not going to be present. This is the great thing about being a writer. I'm not going to be present when someone's reading it. If I were present and I saw them drift off, it would affect my self esteem. If I would, what chapter did they drop? What point in the chapter did they stop reading? When did they start looking at their phone? Like I would really affected by that if I were there, a fly on the wall, watching someone read my work. But the great advantage of being a writer is that I can revise it. I can wait for those moments where my self consciousness doesn't prey on me. It doesn't prey on my creative self. Let me just restate that because
Hmm.
sometimes self consciousness is my best friend because I'm an observer of myself. So, in other words, it helps me observe myself and draw conclusions about myself in my day to day life. But when I'm sitting down before the work, I don't want my self consciousness there. I want
Right.
it there when I'm out in the field because it's an ally. Out in the field, when I'm observing myself, when I'm taking notes on myself. But I don't want it there when I'm sitting down before a blank page. I need to know when its company is appropriate and when it's inappropriate. And over time, I guess I've learned that. With writing, it's easy because I can say, okay, John, meditate, walk around, get this son of a bitch out of your mind. Okay.
Yeah.
But sometimes when I'm speaking, for example, a foreign language, there is the urgency of articulating myself in the moment. And I can't really say, get the fuck out of here to this person who's being so bothersome. I have to kind of sit there and say, okay, I'm just going to try to ignore you in the moment and just sort of wait for you to go. So, my wife is a yoga teacher. So, she always talks about, I guess James Thurber was the first person to say it, but like he never stopped writing. He was always writing. And my wife says, I never stopped doing yoga. It's sort of like you want to live in a constant state of, in her case, meditation. I don't know
Yeah.
that I agree with James Thurber. I think that, like I said, maybe I'm writing when I'm observing myself, I'm taking notes, but it's a different type of writing than it is when I'm sitting down before the page and I kind of want the subconscious mind to help me discover things. That's really our ally, I think, when we're writing. Don't you think, Brendan? That it's especially when we're writing memoir, let's say. I know you have your memoir, and I'm sure when you sit down and write it, the things that move us as writers are the things that we surprise ourselves with. And I think those come from our unconscious mind, don't you think?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's to your point of what your wife was saying about always doing yoga, and I think it's kind of like writing too is always you're always in practice with it. Whether you're sitting down to scribble something, or be it in a journal or a notebook, or you wake up from a dream and you scribble down something. It's like it's always with you, and then the subconscious at times will creep in, and it might be because you heard the chord of a certain song and it just instantly
Yeah,
elicits a memory, and suddenly that memory could be the seed of a scene, and it did come from something that was plucked from your subconscious because of something external, be it a movie, maybe the way an actor's face just expresses a mood, and you're like, oh my god, that's the mood I felt when dad let go of the bicycle, when he taught me how to ride the bike. And it's like all of a sudden you're transported there and you're crying because that's like
sure.
the most intimate moment you've ever felt in your life or something.
Yeah, I've one of the things I've learned recently is to sort of listen to my subconscious because sometimes it'll pop up. In my youth, very often I would be afraid of the suggestions that my subconscious would give me. And that you've sort of articulated it very well. A song, something, an idea will come up. Maybe you go for a walk and you've been stewing over a scene that's blocked. You go for a walk or you take a shit, and suddenly there's an idea that's in your head. And I would silence that in the past because maybe it doesn't fit exactly with what you were stewing on because maybe you just wanted to get a particular sentence to work. and you're dwelling too much on that thing. But whatever idea popped into your head, I've said, okay, let me listen to that. Let's see what that develops into. And maybe it allows you to drop that sentence you were hung up on. Maybe the sentence you were hung up on didn't even need to be there at all, and that your subconscious is giving you a kind of clue that you have to listen to. I'm becoming, I think, a better listener to my subconscious with the years,
Mm-hmm.
because it's just so, it makes life, and I hope my writing, so much more interesting, because the things that my subconscious gives me are very often unpredictable. I didn't know they were going to be there the moment before they came. They don't figure into my outlines. They veer me away from the predictable. And I think, but if I trust them, they're not that far away. They stay within the limits. They kind of show me the limits, or they allow me to interpret the limits in a way that maybe I didn't know before I kind of let my subconscious in. And the more I listen to my subconscious, the more favors it offers me.
Oh, the movie, the Pixar movie Ratatouille, and I'm just thinking of Vigo, or Ego, the food critic, and he's just hardened from a whole life of doing this food criticism. But then he takes that one bite
I
of
remember
the
that scene.
ratatouille,
Yeah,
and it shoots him back to his childhood of having the peasant meal, having his mom serve it to him, and that meal broke through the
sure.
veneer of his his cynicism over the years, and shot him right back to a subconscious moment of his childhood, and it released a floodgate of emotion and things that he just forgot were there. And it's like the subconscious in that way can be a guiding light.
Totally, because it's also like what you said before about, maybe you see the face in a film and it reminds you of a moment with your dad, and suddenly you're weeping. So it's like the emotional blockages that I think that are also creative block, they block our creative mind. So suddenly, even if it's the slightest emotional change, well, that might just give you the tone that's going to lead you to a sentence that's going to solve a particular creative pickle that you're in, or move you on to another, and there'll be a kind of, a building of momentum. And so I think those emotional changes, as you say, from the Pixar film, yes, in that moment he goes from this bitter critic to being this boy open to wonder. And that is something that I think I want my subconscious to give me too. I want to
Mhm.
be open to wonder all the time, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's if we're to write to that moment, or and when memoir is really humming, it does it particularly well, where you're able to take that that feeling, that emotion of something that happened to you, and have it bridge to a reader. Sometimes I think when memoir gets wrong, it becomes a bit too navel gazing, and I wonder why I'm being told this. Like, it's okay, this happened to you, but so what? And
Sure.
and you've read a lot of memoirs, and having written your own. So how do writers, how do memoirists, and there's so many out there, so many aspiring memoirs, get beyond this thing happened to me, to the universal experience that is gonna transport the reader to that emotional moment that we're after?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it takes a lot of time to figure that out.
A lot of
I
time,
mean, I
yeah.
think I think you need, there's just so much garbage that's produced over time. I mean, as we write, I mean, I'm sure you've had a lot of writers tell you this. They throw out 75 or 80% of what they write. I don't know. It's a kind of feel, I guess. I was talking to a friend the other day about sort of the difficulty of, a writer friend of mine, the difficulty of promoting a book. Like,
Mhm.
how do you do it? I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many books that are produced, all the time, and it's so time consuming to sort of read one. You don't wanna be disappointed, you wanna choose right, and, you know, it's like, what is it that what are the type of books that I want to read? Are they the books that have a really snappy elevator pitch? No. They maybe I'll be interested for a moment, but it's a superficial interest. What makes me drawn to a writer or makes me read on is authenticity. I mean, again, this is a word that's probably overly used,
Hmm.
and I don't wanna fall into some sort of cliché, but maybe even go more cliché, something that seems to come from the writer's soul. I mean, it seems essential to him or her, like absolutely essential to him or her. I mean, when someone is navel gazing, like you kind of get the sense that that writer is masturbating. That writer is not really moving forward in any way. That what they're writing about is not essential to them. That's the thing. I think we when we read, we're like, "Why are you wasting your time on this? It's not my time." But if you feel like the writer really cares about this, really cares about this, his something about the writing of this scene or the inclusion of these details is vibrating with something essential. And I mean, I don't know that I can put my finger on what it is, but I know it when I'm reading it. It's something in the vibrations of the prose. So as I'm going through revision after revision, like my Half Orange took me 10 years to write. It went through 2 languages. I had 100 articles that I'd written that I could sort of, I don't know, sew together. And what made me decide to keep something? Well, it's because I felt like in that moment I was saying something essential to me. I felt as though I was in touch with the subconscious, man. You know, sometimes I think that like when we're writing at first and we're sitting down in front of a blank page, it's almost as though we're getting some sort of radio transmission that's really staticky. I mean,
Mm.
sometimes there'll be a kind of stretch of a few seconds of clarity, but then the static will come in and maybe you'll barely hear it. Other times you won't hear it at all. Through sort of many revisions, and you go back to that same transmission. And when you go back to that same transmission, it comes in a little bit clearer. And so the staticky bits come come you start of getting them and then the dead bits are staticky. And over time, you can turn this really bad radio broadcast into something that comes across clean and smooth. But it's like you have to keep plugging back into whatever was transmitting it, whatever was broadcasting it, whether it was from inside me or outside me. I really have no idea. But suddenly you're reading like, "Holy shit, did I write that?" That is when I'm saying, "Okay, I was humming there, and it may not even have been me, but I was plugged into something," you know? But I can bore myself. I bore myself all the time. And I'll look like, "Jesus, this is so boring." I'm like, "God," you
Yeah.
know? And when I feel like, when I teach writing, I always say to my students, you have one assignment, okay? 500 words at least, and then don't bore me. That's it. It's my assignment. Don't
Hmm.
bore me. Okay. And I mean, that's really what it comes down to. I mean, if I don't bore the reader, I mean, maybe sometimes I'm going to bore the reader. I'm not saying I won't always bore the reader, but if that's my goal, not to bore the reader, to have the reader keep reading, and I mean, how do I figure out if I'm not boring the reader? Well, if I'm boring myself. I mean, this is again where my kind of self consciousness comes into play. Maybe on the first draft, I don't want it there, but when I'm revising, I want it there to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, God, oof, who's going to read this? You know?
Yeah. Well, yeah, when it starts to feel stilted and wooden, you're like, yeah, this is, this needs to go." But what's good about it is that it had to get there, at
Sure.
least initially, for it to be removed, and like that sometimes wooden, stilted prose. It might not be in the final product, but it needed to be there to get you somewhere. It
Totally
was
agree.
right, and it's hard. That's where you get away from, if you can divorce the self awareness, especially in the early drafting. It's like you need to lay down the road so you can find out where the potholes are,
Oh,
and
sure.
you
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
just get out of the way and just let that happen, and then you can work on removing things later. So it's like the writing 900 bad words to get to 100 really good ones. You needed those 900 even
You
if they're not
did.
there in the end.
Totally. You absolutely do. I mean, we don't waste our time we don't waste our time when we're writing badly. We're not. That is absolutely necessary to write well. I mean, were we wasting our time? Or I sometimes look back when all my ex-girlfriends, was that a waste of time? I
Mhm.
mean, no. I mean, it allowed me and prepared me. There's a great saying in Spanish. It comes from bullfighting. Just like in English, we've got a lot of phrases that come from sports, like three strikes you're out or the whole 9 yards. I mean, it, the sports phrases are embedded in the language. Well, it's true in Spanish with bullfighting. So, for example, if you say tener mucho mano izquierda, a lot of left hand, that's what the bullfighters use with their cape. It means you have a lot of finesse. Okay? Or if you say poner en suerte, you put someone in luck. Okay, that means that you're basically setting the scene for somebody for basically the last phase of a bullfight when the bullfighter has to go in for the kill. And a lot of that in Spanish culture is about luck. I feel as though a lot of these other experiences with exes sort of put me in luck for my wife. And I think that's true also with prose. I mean, not only in, for example, all the writing we throw out before we get to the final product or the final draft, but also the books and failed attempts that we ended up putting in the drawer forever were absolutely necessary for us to get to the point where we were maybe humming to a certain degree, where even when we wrote badly, it wasn't a lost cause. When I write badly, for example, I can there's still something salvageable. But there was a time in my writing life when I wrote so badly it wasn't salvageable.
Yeah, there's a moment in the book too talking about potentially unsalvageable writing is when you gave your father something to read and he painstakingly called it puerile, and
Yes,
you could tell it like gutted him to tell you that, but he said it out of love and a way to push you to another level. But you felt the anguish of him because he's just like, I know you're better than this, but this is the best thing I can say to you right now.
sure. I was very, very lucky because, I think the best editors have 2 things. They're tremendously skilled and they love you. If you have an editor who loves you, they're always gonna tell you the truth. It's very, very hard to tell someone their writing is bad. It's very hard to tell someone their writing is bad with love, but you need to hear it. And if you're not skilled, well, then if you tell me the writing's bad, well, then why should I believe you? But my father obviously knew what he was talking about. And it was obviously hard for him to say that. There was no sort of like joyful spite in his comment. So just to hear him tell that to me, there was no way I could dismiss it. There was no way that I could disregard what he was saying. I mean, I he's always a voice in my mind. I mean, I'm always going to write to him. I was talking to someone the other day about the book, and they asked me what was my favorite chapter. Well, that's my favorite chapter because the chapter on Adios to the Reverend, which is the chapter I wrote about my father. I mean, when I wrote my Half Orange, I wanted to organize it or structure it according to sort of emotional intensity. I wanted to start out with anecdotes that were kind of lighthearted and funny, and I wanted to go deeper and deeper into sort of family stuff. And
Yeah.
so the final chapters are the most soul wrenching, and that's I wanted the most soul wrenching chapters at the end. And when I sat down to write about my dad, I mean, of course, I'll write about my dad again in my life, but you only had really one chance to do it. I was like, damn, you got to get this one right. I wanted to really. He was there. I planted him in the book, and I knew the book had to sort of pay off there when I got to him. I had to. I had to. That had to. There had to be a payoff of the book, and that's when I had to I stepped up to the plate right there to get
Hmm.
into sports imagery, and it was a 3-2 count, and the bases were loaded, and the pennant was on the line, and I just said, okay, thank God this isn't performance art. I can sit with this. I can reduce it down. I can get it right. I hope I did. I hope I did. I certainly put the time and effort into it, you know?
Yeah, to me, the book really gained a new level of altitude when you hit the moment where you're writing about your dad, and then it blends and segues into your father-in-law and how like
Sure.
and you weren't able to be there with your dad as he lay dying, but that transition to you being able to care for your father-in-law and his declining health, and that was connected in a very, I think, just a very skilled way, and I could feel the transference to be like, okay, this is, for lack of a better term, a tone. Is like, here
Thank
I
you.
can,
Yeah.
the care I wasn't able to give my dad because I was so far away, I can give that to my father-in-law now.
Yeah, it was a kind of serendipitous, really, in a fateful way, what life gave me in Spain. My father was a very wise man, and he was, as I say in the book, lucid into his final moments. And I'm sure he would have given me tremendous advice. But my father in law was also, although he wasn't lucid at the end, he had a kind of bearing which never changed.
Mm,
And that was tremendously illuminating to me, like how someone could sort of die with dignity, almost in silence, without complaining. There were lessons that taught me. My father was a talker. Luis, my father-in-law, was not a talker,
mm.
or he talked only in these sporadic moments. I maybe I didn't know Spanish well enough at first when I met him, and he had all his lights, and I couldn't really talk to him and exchange like I might have, but his character was evident. And when I think one of the things that's hard when you're writing a memoir is to sort of know when to what type of your life, what time of your life. I think there are times, certain times in authors' lives that I think are worthy of memoir. It's not just one time in my life, I don't think, but certainly the moment that I decided to move to Spain, and let's say my father and father-in-law passed away. That, in many ways, was a tremendous window of opportunity in my life that I took good advantage of, or I took well advantage of. I don't even know the right word. I think I took complete advantage of, let's say. There was a transformation that took place in me. I hoped to capture it with my half orange because I think that window of time in my life was rich in transformation. Not only in the language that I spoke. I mean, like I come to Seville, I'm living in a new place. I'm at the same time falling in love. Right off the bat, I'm having kids. All things that I never really thought I'd do, I was suddenly doing. And it kind of dovetailed into, I mean, I think a huge chemical change within me that hasn't I mean, I look back at my old self, Brendan. I look back and I just it feels like a different person. I mean,
Mhm.
totally. I don't that guy that lived in New York. I mean, yeah, I know a lot about him. I don't know. I mean, it seems like another life, really. A really close friend of mine that I've kind of lost touch with. It's really weird, man. Really
Yeah.
weird.
Given that, the book is titled My Half Orange, which is a Spanish saying for like soulmate,
Correct.
and and the emotional crescendo of the book it has to do, really, as we were just talking about your father and like building up to that moment and that payoff. And I wonder, just for you, like naming it for essentially, your wife, but it's still like really the undercurrent of this whole thing is, honoring your father and reconciling your relationship as he passed away and trying to live up to his name. So I just wanted to, get your thoughts on that and the title and where the emotional crescendos come from.
The seminal moment for me was meeting the woman who would become my wife.
Mhm.
So maybe, like I said, all my exes put me in luck or paved the way or smoothed the way for her, and then for family. Then family kind of smoothed the way to sort of appreciating all that my father offered me. That really I couldn't have had the one without the other. I really do feel as though, I mean, my half orange, I think there's a section in the book, or I know there's a section in the book, like, where it's just, I mean, again, "You make me complete." That's such a cliche, right? But there is a kind of sense of this citric thing that a half orange is sort of, like, stuck down on the table. It's stuck, but when you find its other part, it's kind of like rolling. It can be split up and turned into wedges, which is what I call my children, wedge 1 and wedge 2 in the book. There is a kind of sense of, well, I suddenly was able to, let's just say I came into myself more thanks to her.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that allowed me to tap into all that my father gave me. There was that unfinished business that she allowed me to finish. Who became my editor once I was writing in Spanish? Well, she did. Who was doing that before? My father did. In many ways, the book couldn't have been written without her voice always speaking in the
Yeah.
book, you know? Also, there was the fact of, I think that my wife keeps me in line. And I think one of the things that's at the heart of the book is I sometimes say some things that people would frown at. I mean, sexist comments. I mean, and my wife calls me on all my shit. And so
Mhm.
she's a great foil in that regard. She allows me to be myself in the book because she keeps me in line. She's the voice of the reader who might be annoyed at me. So she was, I think, a tremendous help structurally for the book too, because it allowed me to go into territory and to speak about certain issues that might make people uncomfortable, especially after, let's say, the Me Too movement, and there she is, and as she says in the book, I'm a woman, not a feminist. I mean, I think she's a feminist too, but, you know, I like her definition more. I like what she calls herself more. Yeah,
She gave you an anchor and a sense of home abroad, and it wasn't until that foundation was fully rooted that and then you become the writer you are there, and like your father said, being able to write in a second language gave you the forum you deserve as
sure.
a greater sense that like one of the greater compliments he could have ever given you, and that is a direct result of you having this grounded foundation of family abroad, and it bridged the two cultures, it bridged your two cities, and allowed you to reach a certain emotional depth with your homeland and your new home too.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard this, but, like, people would always say to me, you know, "The writing will start giving you things when it's less important to you." Right? And I was like, "What the fuck does that mean?" It's almost like, when my dad would say to me when I used to play sports, he says, "John, just have a good time." I was like, "Well, how can I have a good time when it means so much to you and other people if I do well?"
Hmm.
But I didn't understand what he meant by have fun. I think it means to lose myself in the moment. When I decided to put my writing aside so that I could learn Spanish well enough to defend my family if I needed to, and I said, John, just put it on the back burner. Learn to speak and write Spanish well. Learn to understand what people tell you. All right. Then suddenly I got published. I mean, that is weird. Right, Brendan? I mean, that just seems like it's what people were telling me all the time was gonna happen. I'm not saying that I've reached any kind of grand success. I don't believe that at all, but at least I had people reading me. I had people reading me. And before I had no one reading me. And it only happened when I sort of gave the writing less importance, and I sort of focused on what was really important, which was having fun or living life in this family that I'm not saying I created it because I didn't create it, but life sort of blessed me with. Okay, just live in the blessing, John. Live in the blessing, okay? And maybe other blessings will come. And others did. I mean, and other frustrations came too, but hey, I mean, that's all part of the package, you know?
Yeah, speaking of the fun component, I'll never forget one of my former summer league teammates, Aaron Montero. He's a right fielder. He's a real fast runner, had a bit cannon for an arm, decent hitter. And this one game, I was just in my usual sort of emotional funk towards the end of the bench, and he was on his way. He had already struck out 3 times in the game, and he's going up. He's about ready to go up to the plate. He's like, all right, let's see if it's going to be the time for the golden sombrero, meaning like striking out 4 times. And sure enough, he goes up there, strikes out 4 times for his fourth time, gets 4 hats, and puts one forward, 2 sideways, one backwards, and he's got the golden sombrero. And he's just laughing, and I'm looking up at him, and I'm like, oh my god, like if I struck out 4 times in a game, you might not be getting me out of bed in the morning. And
Seriously,
here he
yes.
is striking out 4 times and just like, all right, he's just going to go out in the field and try to be the best fielder he can be. And that was just incomprehensible to me.
Incomprehensible to me too. Yeah.
Yeah. And and you talking about trying to find the fun, and it's like it's so integral. Like there are going to be many over 4 days, and no one's going to care. It's how we bounce back from it. And so, how have you maintained? My long my long little diatribe here. How have you maintained the fun and found the fun? Even when things might not necessarily be going great.
Well, you know what's a big help, especially on the radio? In that, it's part of my creative life now, and I get paid to do this, and it's all off the cuff, basically performance art. It's what are called tertulias. I do very little preparation, and I just kind of wing it. Okay, and I make a ton of errors. It's impossible for me not to make errors, and I mean, thousands of people are listening and laughing at me, and partially with me. And I'm like, sometimes I'll listen to it with my wife, and I'm like, "Oh my god, how do you understand me?" I'll say to my wife, and it's like, it's almost being able to, if I'm making partially my living, I'm almost triumphing with my errors. I swear to you, Brendan, it's like the more I fuck up on the radio, the more people talk about me. It's funny. I have a lot of followers on Instagram. I teach languages. I teach English and Spanish on Instagram. So I've got this. I've got 375,000 people following me on Instagram. Okay,
Hmm.
and I did a post the other day that got me 50,000 new followers. It got me an interview on Miami, Univision Miami something, right? And you know why? It was so because I made mistakes. I was recommending 3 other English teachers online that I thought were good, and I made 3 bad errors in Spanish. So all these people started attacking my Spanish. All these people, and I just responded to them that you are the reason why people are afraid to speak another language. And so it created this kind of momentum of I triumphed with my errors. I mean, that was a perfect example. People say, "Why don't you take the post down and repost it?" And I was like, "Do you understand what's driving the traffic of this piece? It's got more than I think it's got something like 2 million views now, and it's all because of the people were talking in the comments section, arguing with each other, some defending me, some kind of like criticizing my mm, ineptitude in Spanish. It was just amazing how I think you to get back to the question. You asked me, how do I maintain it? Well, I think a constant reminder of my mistakes are not important and in fact can help me is the fact that I am making them all the time on the social networks and I am making them all the time on the radio. On the social networks, it's great because you can kind of like make bad posts and you can bounce back. You can write 5 or 6 bad posts, and then suddenly you'll put one up that'll get a million views. Like how does that happen? Well, it was just I was plugged in that moment, but I don't really care about the social networks. I don't really care. I mean, sure, it's nice that people know me. It's nice that I like the attention. It's a kind of boost to my ego, but my ego's not really tied up in that. My ego's tied up in writing. My ego's not tied up in the amount of people following me because I create interesting language lessons. That's not what that's not what motivates me because it's not really tied to my identity. But nonetheless, it's a constant reminder of my mistakes do not affect my growth. They do
Mm.
not affect my success in a particular field. In fact, they can actually help me. I mean, there are actual examples like that post I put up the other day. Perhaps my worst post in the sense of like the 3 shameful errors that I made in there because I didn't really didn't really review it before I put it up. I just banged it out. So it got me 50,000 new followers on Instagram. How is that fucking possible? 3 mistakes. It's so bizarre, man. So bizarre.
I made about a 5-minute cut in this little section, and to give you context about what comes next in the sequence of this conversation, it was just something that John had brought up about a very small independent press that published My Half Orange. So that should give you the little runway here to understand what's coming next. Yeah, and that's what's great about an independent press or anything. And I'll talk about baseball momentarily to get back to the point I ultimately want to make. Is like I was obsessed with. Well, I was erroneously thought to get to the major leagues, I had to play Division One ball. Only way you could get there. It's the only path, which is
Mhm.
nonsense. All you have to do, yeah, you have to have the talent, you have to have the ability, the talent, whatever. You need to be on the field. It doesn't matter where. You can
Mm.
be a Division 3 player, and sure, there's no scholarship money. Sure, the competition might not be quite as good, but if you have tangibles and intangibles, the
Right.
scouts will find you. You go to the right camps. Talent rises, cream rises to the top. I didn't understand that at the time because my ego was tied, and my dad's ego was tied to you're at you want to be this level to be able to say you played Division 1. Other people that I played with, who I was every bit as good at, if not better, were getting scholarships. I wasn't. It was one of those things where it was more of a status symbol. I think of that too with writers. It's like, yeah, it would be nice to have big 5 publishing deals, whatever. But what matters is, and this is what brings it back around, is getting on the field and getting having a publisher believe in you, no matter how small they are, and it gets you on the field to then be noticed, to then write the next one, and it gives you it puts wind behind your sails because it is still traditionally published, even if it is independently published, and it's I don't I always just want people to realize that it's just all that matters is getting on the field.
It is. I mean, I would even be these days I'm suspicious of stuff that comes out from big 5 publishers.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is very much politically based. I think a lot of it, if they're not gonna make money off of a book, they want the book to reflect on them in a good way, okay? And that I think is just not I don't think they're choosing books for literary quality. I
Mm-hmm.
think politics is so wrapped up in American society today that I think it pollutes the arts. It dilutes the arts. And I think a lot of books coming out of the top 5 or the big 5 publishers, I think are sullied by that in a way or diluted by that. I think that vocational publishers, I mean, Tortoise Books just came out. I just read another book from Tortoise Books called The Birth Parents, by this 35-year-old writer named Frank Santo. I can't believe this book wasn't published by one of the big five, but Frank Santo is white and he's writing about working in the welfare system in the Bronx. A lot of his characters are people of color. And I could see all the red flags coming out if this were put before the editorial board or the marketing team of one of the big five, but the guy fucking nailed it.
Mm.
I mean, he fucking nailed it. And thanks to a small publisher like Tortoise Books, they were able to look at the literary quality, and it is a tremendous book. It's a great novel about New York City. And this guy's a 35-year-old Dartmouth grad, Frank Santo, and he really, really writes authentically about the Bronx from the perspective of someone of privilege entering into that world and trying to make a difference in being aware of all the nuances of that. He wrote a great novel about that. But maybe the big five can't really publish that. They don't want to publish that because what will that say about them? You know, I don't. I'm suspicious of the publishing model is changing, man. It's
Yeah.
changed big time, and I don't think we can trust. You know that the big five know what they're doing. They don't know anything more about promoting books than you and me. They really don't. Maybe they got money, maybe they got connections, New York Times, but you know, like I was stunned when I heard Bryn Jonathan Butler say in one of his podcasts that when he was featured on the front of the art section in the New York Times and his book was mentioned, it only moved 1,500 copies. That's
Mm-hmm.
it. That's it. The New York Times front page, huge photos, everything. The book about Cuba. It only moved 1,500 copies. I mean, in my youth, that would have moved 15,000
Yeah. Yeah.
minimum. We're talking 1,500. Brendan, that's nothing. And that's the New York Times. I mean, come on. It's a different publishing model. That's not how people get their book recommendations now. I just don't think they do. I don't know what they are, but I think people it's really it's a mystery, but no one's really figured it out yet. You know, what makes a book take off, you know? But it's not necessarily the New York Times, you know?
Yeah, it's what ultimately I believe it comes down to, and speaking of someone who has not sold a lot of books, but I think it's writing something that not only that I'm gonna buy, but I'm gonna buy 3 copies for my friends because 'cause I'm like, "This is so good, you guys need to read this." And then you hope that they feel similarly with 3 other people. And then it does spread exponentially in that sense. But I'm not saying it's easy, but it is kind of the simple equation to great to great book success. It's just
Yeah.
is it remarkable? Like, are we talking about it? Do I need to buy multiple copies so all my friends can have it and we can be like, oh, I need you to read this. I want to talk to you about it. It's like a movie, like you got to see
Sure.
this movie. Oh my God. The ending is, I need you to see this because I need to talk to you about it. Like we need more of that in the book world.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like, I wonder about, for example, this new memoir that's out called Molly. I think, Blake something wrote it.
The author is Blake Butler. And a little bit about the book. It got some buzz. His wife Molly, she died by suicide, and he made some discoveries afterward and wrote about them, and it raised all sorts of ethical questions.
But there's this kind of controversy around it because he writes about his relationship with this woman. It begins with him going out for a run one day when his wife is feeling down, and he comes back and she's kind of committed. She has committed suicide.
Mm,
And then he goes deep into her kind of past, I think looking at her diaries. I wouldn't quote me on this, but I'm sort of paraphrasing it wrong, but he sort of comes out that she was sleeping with her students and, cheating on him, and he was also cheating on her. And so there was this big brouhaha of whether he was appropriating her story because she's also a memoirist or she was a poet. And so this created this kind of literary controversy. And so now he's on all the literary podcasts. And,
mm,
people are talking about his book. There's a buzz about his book, again, because he kind of walked the line that, was maybe appropriate, inappropriate. There's a kind of morbid interest that sort of and buzz around his book also that I think propels it. But I wonder, like, are people buying the book because of that, I wonder? Like, is that producing sales? There's so much information that I would love to know. That why is it not available to us? Like, I would love to know, like, how many Mollies have been sold since the controversy started? I would
mm.
just love to know that detail. Like, why is that not available? I'm sure there's reasons why it's not available, but it just that would be such useful information to know as far as marketing books. But so much of it is in secret. Like, I can't talk to my publisher. Well, how many books have you sold? How many have you sold? People are quiet on that front. It's weird.
It is weird. Getting back to our earlier in our conversation about, having fun or like being kind of in that moment of appreciation. It's just like being able to hold it and like actually give yourself credit for that, I think is real important.
Yeah, it is, That's why I'm so grateful for the work that Tortoise Books put into the editing of it. You know, it really allows me to sort of look back on the work and be pleased that I was pushed to do the best job I could. Like, one of the things about writing is you never really know what you did. I mean, I
Yeah.
can read another person's writing and I can say, well, I can see what they did, but I'm too close to my own work to sort of see the finished project. Whenever I hear another writer say like, "This is my best book," I'm like, "You're full of shit. You don't know what's the best book. You know what your best book is. You can hope it's your best book, but you don't know if it is. So but I do know that I was pushed by many people to make it better at various stages, and it did become better. I don't know. I can be objective enough to say it became better thanks to people pushing me at various stages. Could it have become even better and even better? I don't know. But I know that thanks to what people said to me and thanks to advice people gave me and suggestions people gave me, it jumped about 4 or 5 levels. So I'm very, very grateful because, hey, those 4 or 5 levels are important. If they didn't hit those levels, if people didn't make me see the work as it was in that moment, I might have seen it after it was between covers. And then that would have been, oh, you know what I
Mm,
mean?
yeah,
So anyway, so I'm very grateful for the work that Tortoise put into, editing it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, John, as I like to bring these conversations down for a landing, I always love asking the guest for a recommendation of some kind. It can just be like anything you're excited about that you want to share with the listeners. So I would just pose that to you. What would you recommend for them out there?
Well, what I'm excited about, what I sort of said before, I mean, I'm always looking for a really good literary podcast. And I mean, having discovered the other day this book by or this podcast by Brad Listy, and did you have him on because he was a writer, or did you have him on to talk about his podcast with you?
A little of both. Last year, he came out with a work of auto fiction called "Be Brief and Tell Them Everything," and
Ah, okay.
it's a great book. I really really recommend it. One of my favorite books of last year, and so
Wow.
had him on to talk about that. It's probably 95% memoir, maybe 5%
Huh.
imaginative. So it's technically a novel, but it's practically a memoir. So
Huh.
it's
Maybe I'll do it for book rants.
yeah,
Maybe
it's
I'll Yeah.
really good, really funny, really sad, and it checks all the boxes. It's just really good. It's tight. It's just really, really well done. And yeah, and of course, when he was on, we just talked about the podcast. I mean, he started his, gosh, if you think 2013 when I started, mine was early. He started other people in 2010, I think. So
Wow.
we were kind
Yeah.
of on that very first crest of the second podcast boom, but he even got ahead of me.
Well, I mean, I do want to say this. I'm impressed that you have, stuck with it all those years. I mean, that's admirable stuff. I mean, I do think that we got to kind of give back. And I know that Brad Listy is a writer as you are. And in a way I'm with Book Rants, it's my sort of contribution to that. I mean, like we have to appreciate the work of others. I don't know if that brings speaking coming back to the sort of publicity. Does that bring readers to our own work? I
I
wonder.
I
I
bel
don't know.
I have to believe so because I had when we were talking about that a while ago, and you brought up kind of book promoting. To me, I think the best way to promote your own work is by celebrating others. It's and so I have to think that in doing Brad doing what he's done for other authors and platforming them, or you reviewing things on Book Grants on YouTube, or me doing this for nonfiction writers over the years, it builds a body of work and a sense of community and goodwill that will, when it's time for us to put our work out there, people be like, oh, it's like it's time for, not that this is why I did it, but maybe it's a nice byproduct of having celebrated so many other people that when it's my time to be celebrated, people are going to be there for it.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I'm seeing this podcast, I'm like, okay, I'm just as interested in his questions as I am in her answers.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
that creates a curiosity. I heard the other day your interview with by the way, I love the fact that you're putting out the paperback edition
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
Love it. It's great stuff. So I heard the interview that you gave with was it from Townie, Andre Dubas
Oh
III?
yeah, yeah.
You
Under the
had
abuse.
wonderful questions, man. Wonderful.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I mean it's like, I'm like, okay, because I know how hard it is to be articulate on the spur of the moment with a question. I'm sure you prepare a little bit, but but also there's a sense of your questions of being spur of the moment questions, and I think the ability to articulate a question that's incisive and precise and touches on something that allows the person to give an interesting answer has to be tied to the ability to be a creative writer.
Mm,
So when I'm listening to Brad Listy, for example, I'm thinking, okay, the way this guy is asking questions, the way that he's composing questions in the moment, and the way they're pulling on whatever you have to pull on to get a solid answer from Lauren Serrant, that has to be tied to his fiction or his nonfiction. And the fact that you have recommended his book as also partially nonfiction, well, in a way, right, his podcast drew me to his work, right? And if I pick
yeah.
up his book and I review his book, well, then it's his work, his extracurricular outside of his own stuff that's drawing me to his stuff. So I know what you mean. It's like it's almost we're not doing the book rants or creative nonfiction or other people because we want people to come to our work, but it's almost
Yeah.
a part of our work.
Thank you. Yes. It's like my new favorite thing to do at the end of the show is like the what was it? Sean William Scott in Old School with the Darkos in his neck, and he's like, "Yes." Thanks to John. Thanks to you. Name of his book again is My Half Orange. It's published by Tortoise Books. And here we go. This is a parting shot. Parting shot. It's actually kind of long. It might be a little too long. Whatever. You're here now, Kelsey. By the time you hear this, I will have perhaps, I don't know, my last stab, my last chunk of major edits. What a word, chunk. Before we have to ferry this fucker along the assembly line, that fucker being the Prefontaine biography. That fucker. The last couple weeks, mildly interrupted by a visit from my in-laws, have been largely focused on part one of the book. The two likely titles are most likely going to be, so the gift is no longer going to be the title. It's going to be most likely the front runner. I kind of like just front runner, but we'll see. Or the last amateur. It's likely going to be front runner or the front runner. But the latter, the last amateur, is a little smarter given the context of the times, and will take some massaging to draw out that greater theme. But we're not exactly dealing with someone who deals in smarter, so expect the front runner. Anyway, at times, well, most times, I get the sense that my very astute editor is thinking, like, why can't you grasp this simple concept of shaping an interpretation? Why are we paying you to write this book? The chapters need to be more than just chronology. And he's correct. He's always correct. And here's why. I think this is what, I don't know if you want to say this is what set the book back early on, but I guess it did. My rough draft, I truly didn't have like what you would consider a grand vision or even a true point of view, aside from me just wanting to tell this man's story more or less from A to Z. I merely wrote through the guy's life, which is interesting unto itself, but it had no real authorial interpretation as to why this matters, X matters, and Y matters. I was skating over the surface. As a result, my rough draft, this 160,000 word thing, that it could only be classified as like a narrative timeline, basically. My first draft was 55 chapter, 120,000 word, still basically a timeline, though far leaner by, 25%, I guess. I'm doing the math here. My second draft was something like an 18 chapter, 119,000 word timeline. Okay, so now we're starting to distill things. We're merging chapters that have more cohesion. Now we're really interrogating things that should have been interrogated a long, long time ago. What is this chapter saying, B.O.? What work is it doing? And what I'm finding is that things can now get plucked out of chronology and placed where it belongs in a more thematically germane way. My first couple drafts had a lot of races and a lot of ancillary characters that I found interesting, but it was still too much. And even right now, there's still too much, and we're really working on that. What are they really saying about the Steve Prefontaine that I'm talking about, and what are they adding to the story? They have to stand for something. They need to matter. Otherwise, the reader will just skim them and look for a time. Like, oh, isn't that nice? He ran 3:54 and change, blah, blah, blah. One race I had described in great detail is now 2 sentences long because it lost the audition to another race that needed more stage time. And it's not like I gave it that one more stage time, more words. It's just it's an addition by subtraction. By giving the other one only 2 sentences and basically leaving the other one the same, the latter here it stands taller. There is, however, a moment from that one race that I cut down to 2 sentences where like Steve blew off one of his rivals in a very cold, condescending, like real dickhead way. And as much as I love it in the chronology, it'll stay because it's a really evocative detail. But it's going to go somewhere else more as a callback to kind of dissolve like with like and keep one particular character siloed in this one moment so it's not spread out over 2 places. All right, so what's the goddamn point, B.O.? The point is, to get good at writing books, we need book practice. And the problem with book practice is you might write a book and it doesn't get published. This biography will, I think, still be published. But the truth is, to get better at writing books, you have to write books. And the problem is that writing books takes a shit ton of time. And many of us will write a book, and because we put all that effort, all that time, into it, we feel we are owed something for our efforts. A book deal, publication, no matter how small or big a book deal is, it's just like, wow, yeah, I put in all this effort. Gosh, I want to have something to show for it. It's not too much to ask, but unfortunately, it kind of is. This biography process has taught me just how bad I am at writing books. And I've been a writer for 20 years. Yeah, this book will be the fourth one I've written. My first was an unpublished, though I tried. My God, did I try. Before a mentor told me, sometimes we write books and they don't get published. That's my great takeaway from earning an MFA right there. My second book, 6 Weeks in Saratoga, did get published through serendipity, and I might share that story again. I've frequently shared it over the run of the podcast, and longtime listeners know, but maybe there are a few of you in there who don't know how that book actually came to pass. Maybe I'll share that for another time. True luck there. It's a cool book, and I stand by it. I think it's a fine book, but my God, the luck of how that got published. Otherwise, I doubt it would have been. Third book, Baseball Memoir, Tools of Ignorance, still in the drawer, unpublished. And so we come to my fourth book that if it hadn't been for a dynamite pre-sale of the book and a friend even introducing me to an agent who thought she could sell it on proposal, would likely not be published either. And that's its own form of serendipity, I guess. But here we are. This one is likely going to be published. And it's the fourth one I've written. All of this to say is writing books is very hard, no matter how skilled a writer you are. Thanks to my guidance from people like Glenn Stout and my book editor, Matt Harper, I am monumentally better equipped to crack the code on the next, if I'm so granted that opportunity. I guess if you want to get better at symphonies or murals or sculptures, I'm thinking like very big art projects, you have to do the long, hard, seemingly wasteful work of failing before you ever get good at something big. I consider book writing big, and it hurts when you can't get your book published, and maybe there are obvious reasons why, like it might just not be good. Or other less obvious reasons, like the taste of an agent or publisher just doesn't align. Our best shot at publishing books, like essays and short stories or flash essays and features and profiles, and those are just far more, the barrier of entry, if you will, or the bar is far lower on those, and you can crank out those with more frequency, is you just got to do a lot of them. And it's hard to do a lot of books because books just take a long time. There's no wisdom on offer here other than merely keep plugging so long as you love it. If a book isn't landing, just write the next one, because you're one book better than before. And that's all you can really control, is getting one book better at a time. So stay wild, CNFers, and if you can't do, interview. See ya.